My fellow Americans, my name is Major Mike Webb, and for 2 decades, I was one of the over 1.3 million men and women on active duty and over 1 million serving in the reserve component National Guard. Primarily engaged in the duties of force projection, especially while serving as a special operations soldier assigned to the elite 75th Ranger Regiment, and in the duties of force protection as both a military intelligence officer trained at Fort Huachuca, as well as a commander in the reserve component for basic training units, going annually to training installations such as Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, as well as serving as an instructor and officer in charge during the conduct of summer session at the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. One of my most coveted remarks on an officer evaluation report was delivered by a former Iron Major who had served at the Pentagon in the office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, or DESINT, who said, with regard to my complete candor as an officer, Mike has always told me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it. And for over a year, I've been involved in litigation in both state and federal courts on issues arising from the current public health crisis, which have not yet been reported in any press account, and which carries a brief description in the Progressive Voters Guide regarding my candidacy in the race for Arlington Public School Board, a public school division that had angered many local residents because of their decision to close public schools. That I am opposed to the government response to COVID-19. But while that description was meant to dissuade voters and disparage my character, I believe that my position is quite in line with what most Americans are thinking right now. Americans who are frustrated and perhaps even a bit frightened and confused about a topic that is global and simply too vast for most of us to comprehend. But I have one unique advantage that bolsters my confidence. A part of my military training and experience was beginning to prepare for such a contingency as this almost 30 years ago. And for the next few minutes, let's look at the situation map to provide you a better understanding of the issues that we have been confronting in head-on battle in the courts, both state and federal. According to the Wall Street Journal, a publication that is well respected by many, especially in the business community, in 2020, if the president was elected with any mandate at all in a record-breaking voter participation election, it was concerned about a response to the current global public health crisis, which is often described as the pandemic. A description derived from the declaration by the World Health Organization on March 11, 2020. And today, the total number of American fatalities leading the world has peaked over 700,000 dead, climbing rapidly from just over 600,000 just 3.5 months ago, despite the fact that since that time, attempting to reach what was described to the American people as herd immunity, over 60% of Americans have been vaccinated with products produced by Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson at a cost of billions of dollars. This acceleration of the death rate is what would be described in science as an anomaly, a term most often associated with the Harvard University professor of science philosophy, Thomas Kuhn, who believed it was the business of science to resolve anomalies with unified theories, to establish a paradigm in thought which future outcomes might be more easily predicted on a rational basis. This is the essence of the methodology of science, which examines causes and effects, not just speculates and guesses. Everything in science to a scientist has a discoverable cause that can be articulated, or you will try to find it. Yet according to Dr. David Dowdy, an infectious disease epidemiologist at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in Maryland, in an interview recently with the Miami Herald, it's safe to say that at least 70,000 of the last 100,000 deaths were in unvaccinated people. According to Dr. Dowdy, we could have prevented 90% of those deaths had we been more effective in our vaccinations program. And according to Dr. Dowdy, of those vaccinated people who died in breakthrough infections, most of them caught the virus from an unvaccinated person. And just to hear the word doctor, sometimes many of us, wrapped in emotion, find assurance in those words. However, Voting for science for the next few months, let's examine these claims like a scientist and ask ourselves, what would a scientist do? What would a scientist think, beginning with the last claim and working our way back to the beginning? Of those vaccinated persons who died through breakthrough infections, it is Dr. Dowdy's opinion that most of them caught the virus from unvaccinated persons. Would not a scientist ask for facts to support that hypothesis or theory? What are the facts upon which the doctor relied? Or do you just base your decisions on faith? According to the Los Angeles Times, the breakthrough infections that had claimed the lives of vaccinated persons were caused by comorbidities, primarily amongst the elderly, who were a vulnerable population at risk, known from the very, very beginning, mostly because of their comorbidities. Despite over 85% of that age cohort having been prioritized for vaccinations from the beginning, along with persons employed in the profession of public health, who were the very first in priority for vaccinations. And the very first person vaccinated, even before the elderly, in Virginia was an emergency room worker at the Centara Hospital in Norfolk. Yet, from the very beginning of the public health crisis in the United States, there have been practically no outbreaks nor infections that have been associated with hospitals, other than in elderly homes and also veterans care facilities. So they have been one of the safest places in America to be, although this is not the case in other similarly developed nations like the United Kingdom and Israel, which is what a scientist, thinking like a scientist, would again describe as an anomaly, which must be resolved as a scientist to create a unified theory to better enable policymakers to develop reliable predictions and reason-based policy. Yes, I went to the courts because I was opposed to the fact that we were not following the science. Moreover, if the elderly with comorbidities were still going to be fatalities, the question arises as to why they had been prioritized for vaccinations in the first place, especially if they were not going to work, and especially today as we look at the rise of 100,000 in just the past 3.5 months, the highest acceleration that has been witnessed throughout the entire pandemic, and occurring at a time when most believed the vaccines would have altered this outcome, and at a time that we are now pushing to vaccinate our children. But Dr. Dowdy, as a doctor at the distinguished Johns Hopkins University, wants us to believe that most of the fatalities caused the virus from unvaccinated persons. And 90% of the fatalities could have been prevented if there had been a more effective vaccination program. However, as a doctor, Dr. Dowdy and Virginia Governor Ralph Northam are more aware than most Americans that getting the virus is a direct function of being exposed to the virus through either some infected person with the virus or being in a location where the virus is present in sufficient quantities for that exposure to give rise to a disease condition. Our bodies are naturally designed to resist invasion from threats in our environment. And even the National Academies of Sciences have stated that every day we are confronted with potentially dangerous microbes in the air that we breathe. But they pose no threat to our bodies because we have what may fairly be described as a natural immunity. Our immune system, except in immune-compromised persons, is equipped to handle low-level threats. And it is this biological system that a vaccine is supposed to be designed to bolster and equip to defend against more dangerous threats. Yet in the past 3.5 months, our death rate has accelerated with over 100,000 dead, again, primarily the elderly. Both the CDC and the FDA have conceded that even persons who are fully vaccinated are still capable of shedding their viral load, just like a person who is unvaccinated. And in July in Provincetown, Massachusetts, almost 800 persons, primarily men, primarily gay, attended indoor events at which they experienced breakthrough infections, making it wholly inconceivable that 90% of those infections were caused by unvaccinated persons, at least when thinking like a scientist and examining the facts. Unlike the Spanish flu, a variant of H1N1 avian flu, which found persons infected in the city of Philadelphia who had participated in the Liberty Loan Parade, and which was responsible for over 1,000 deaths within just a week after that parade. In over a year, there have been no similar adverse outcomes associated with large outdoor social gatherings. And on just yesterday, in the nation's capital, relying on that predictable record, thousands of abortion activists demonstrated in the nation's capital to protest the policies in Texas. Science is empirical observation and building reliable predictions for the future based upon an established record of past successes. Yet for a scientist, this anomalous pattern regarding no outdoor infection risk is not consistent with the validation of the presence of a highly contagious disease, because it suggests that the computational fluid dynamics of outdoor wind streams and currents would disperse any concentrations of what had been described as a highly contagious disease. Quite simply, if a low infectious dose is required to cause an infection, COVID-19 would be just as transmissible as it was in Provincetown in an indoor event as it is in an outdoor event, as clearly has not been the case. And this is consistent with the early findings by the WHO in February 2020, which found no outbreaks associated with large social gatherings and which found infections highly correlated with clustered locations, such as in homes of farming families in the most populous city in the central mainland of China. And if a location is the primary factor associated with infection outbreaks, to a scientist, the disease is not being transmitted from person to person, which was expressly stated in the 40-page report that had been prepared by the WHO in February 2020. And despite claims of evolving science, nothing at all, even the Delta variant, has changed about COVID-19. So why would Dr. Dowdy make these claims with no evidence, like the voter fraud claims that many rejected in the last election? Probably because, as a doctor, he thought that you would believe them. Why has Dr. Northam and Dr. Fauci made similar claims with no evidence? Probably because, as a doctor, he thought that you would believe them. That is the question, however, that you need to ask and answer for yourself, and one that we shall continue to raise in the courts in what were the first and longest surviving litigations against the lockdowns and facial coverings in Virginia, and the first litigation brought against the vaccines in the Commonwealth. Because like many Americans, I oppose the government response to the public health crisis. But when I opposed it, I went to court with facts. But when I went to court, it was not I, but the government who ran away. An empirical fact that the press decided not to report for whatever reason. This briefing is unclassified, as you were. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. Carry on. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.